Revelation 11, the two witnesses. I think it's generally acknowledged that Revelation 11 is the hardest chapter in the book to understand. So my sympathies are entirely with the question. This isn't an easy chapter. So what we need to do is to put it in its context. So we go back to chapter 8. In Revelation chapter 8, in the opening verses, John sees 7 angels who have 7 trumpets. And in the rest of chapter 8, the blowing of the first 4 trumpets is recorded. And time and again we have the word third. So verse 7, the first angel sounded, hail, fire mingled with blood, third part of trees was burned up. In verse 8, third part of the sea became blood. Third part of the creatures which were in the sea and had life died. Third part of the ships were destroyed. Verse 10, third part of the rivers and fountains of waters. Verse 12, fourth angel sounded, third part of the sun was smitten, and the moon and the stars. So it's 1/3 of something, and I suggest that something is the Roman Empire. And the western third was destroyed by 4 successive invasions of barbarians from the north, Goths and Vandals and Huns. And then in verse 13 of chapter 8, I beheld and heard the angel flying through the midst of heaven, saying with a loud voice, woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, by reason of the other voices of the trumpet of the 3 angels which are yet to sound. So because of that, the last 3 trumpets, 5, 6 and 7, are known as the woe trumpets. So number 5 is sounded, and these locusts come forth and they destroy. And that historically is Muhammad and the Saracens, who went all along North Africa, over the Straits of Gibraltar, the Pillars of Hercules, into Spain, where they became known as the Moors. And they took over that third of the Roman Empire, the North African third. And then in verse 13, the 6th angel sounded, and I heard a voice from the 4 horns of the golden altar saying, loose the 4 angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates. And historically, 4 great groups of Turkomans came out of that Euphrates valley and warred against the remaining third, the last third, the eastern third of the Roman Empire. Starting in 1062 with Togrul Beg and Alp Arslan. That's 4 years before the Battle of Hastings, if we want a sort of time fix in our chronology. And culminating 391 years and 1 month later, in May 1453, when Constantinople fell. Now, we might think that's the end of the 6th trumpet, but it isn't. Turn on to Revelation 11 and verse 14. Verse 13 talks about a great earthquake and the 10th part of the city fell. But then verse 14 says, the 2nd woe is past, and behold the 3rd woe cometh quickly. So the 6th trumpet, the 2nd woe, started in chapter 9 verse 13, but it carries on right up to verse 14 of chapter 11. So we would expect the events of chapter 11 to be within the time span of the second half of the 6th trumpet. The first half ended in 1453, so we would expect then that the major events of Revelation 11 are going to happen sometime after 1453, chronologically. So that's the first point. Second point is that in Revelation 11 there are 3 different parties, 3 different characters, 3 different groups. First of all, in verse 1, we've got the temple of God and the altar and them that worship therein. Now we know in New Testament terms that the temple of God is the saints. We're all lively stones built up to a holy temple. So we've got the saints there in verse 1, those who understand and believe and hold the truth. And then we've got another party which is variously called in verse 2 the Gentiles, and the God of the earth in verse 4, and the beast that ascendeth out of the bottomless pit in verse 7. And these are aggressive and warlike individuals. And in between the two, we've got the two witnesses who are mentioned in verse 3 onwards. So we've got the saints on the one hand, we've got the beast system, the Catholic system on the other hand, and in between the two we've got the two witnesses. So that's our context. Now, when Constantine came to the throne in 312, he immediately tried to impose uniform beliefs of religion throughout the empire. He favoured Christianity, but he wanted only his own brand or his mother's brand of Christianity to be believed. And anybody who believed anything different about the nature of Christ or other things was a heretic and was persecuted. And so we read in verse 2, "The holy city shall they tread underfoot 42 months." That's 1,260 days, and that runs from 312, Constantine becomes emperor, to 1572, the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day. So those who believed the truth all through that period were persecuted. So that's 1572. Not long after that, Henry of Navarre, Henry IV of France, issued what was called the Edict of Nantes, which gave religious freedom. Henry was a Protestant, and the Edict of Nantes gave religious freedom to all peoples in France to believe and teach as they wished. So the Protestants protested against the evils of Catholicism. And that went on until 1685. And in 1685, Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes and clamped down on the Protestants and would not allow them to protest. And that, I suggest, is verse 7. "The beast that ascendeth out of the bottomless pit, the abyss, shall make war against them and shall overcome them and kill them." And then we've got this mysterious verse 8. "Their dead bodies shall lie in the street of the great city, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt, where also our Lord was crucified." Now, Jesus wasn't crucified in Rome or in Sodom or in Egypt. But there was a certain evil Roman emperor called Caracalla who loved spending money, and his desire to spend money exceeded his revenue from taxes. So how do I get more money, he said. And what he did was he made the whole of the Roman Empire the city of Rome. So wherever you lived in the Roman Empire, you were a citizen of Rome. Therefore you had to pay Rome's taxes. That augmented his income tremendously, and he got on and spent and spent and spent. So verse 8 is actually describing the Roman Empire. The great city comes later on, Babylon. Sodom, Egypt, where Jesus was crucified. He was crucified in the Roman Empire. And their dead bodies lay there for 3 days and a half, says verse 9. Now, there was a Baptist minister in England called Mr. Bacino, who in 1793 considered the events that had just happened, including the French Revolution, with its declaration of the rights of man, which gave universal freedom of religion to all men, basically back to the Edict of Nantes. And Mr. Bacino realised that the interval between the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, which clamped down on the Protestants, and the declaration of the rights of man, which gave them their freedom again, never to be taken away, was 105 years. And the time period that we've got in verse 9 is 3 days and a half. Now, Jesus said that there are 12 hours in the day. So 1 hour in scriptural terminology represents a month. So 3 days and a half give us 3 times 30, 90 days, plus the half, which is 15 days, 105 days. And Mr. Bacino worked out it's exactly 105 years between the revocation of the Edict of Nantes and the declaration of the rights of man. And during that 105 years, the Protestants, the witnesses, were subdued. But then they were allowed to revive again, as verse 10 and onwards tell us. So what Mr. Bacino realised, only 3 years after the end of the time period, was actually we've got a double reduction. We've got day for a year twice. So 3.5 days equals 105 years. And Brother Thomas was so impressed with his reasoning, he reproduced a great chunk of Mr. Bacino's writing in Eureka, because Brother Thomas came to the conclusion that Mr. Bacino had actually got it right. There were some amazing Bible students around in those days. There was a French Protestant called Pierre Juriot, who wrote in 1689, so that's 100 years before the French Revolution. And he said, the 10th part of the city which here fell will at some future time appear to be the kingdom of France, where a revolution will take place about the year 1785, and a separation from the papacy will follow. He got it right within 3 years. There was a revolution in France and a separation from the papacy, and the witnesses revived. So my belief is that the witnesses are the secular and religious protesters against the Catholic system, who for over 2 centuries, when they were allowed to, witnessed, and their witness culminated in the French Revolution, when a 10th part of the city fell. There was a great earthquake, and ultimately the Pope lost his temporal power. He was arrested by Napoleon and imprisoned, and later on he lost his temporal power, and he was reduced to the state that he himself described, I am only a prisoner in the Vatican. So those are my thoughts on Revelation 11. Thank you.